Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to pause a few moments here and give everybody a chance to get on, and we'll get started. We still have some folks filtering in here, but I can get started with some housekeeping. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming. This webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be sent out within 48 hours. So look for that. And Jennifer's also going to be providing a handout, and that'll also be included in the replay. So we're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. So if you could please submit your questions using the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be able to see those more easily. And if you have any tech questions, please message me or Erica in the chat. We'll be more than happy to help you figure those out. So now I'm going to introduce Dr. Jennifer King. She was a research scientist, and she has a decade of experience in advocacy. She's also an Orton Gillingham trained tutor and the founder of Dysgraphia Life, an organization that provides information, education, beneficial products, and services to those with learning disabilities and writing difficulties. And Dr. King will also be a presenter at our 60th Annual International Conference in Las Vegas, so be sure to learn more about that at ldacon.org. So Jennifer, thank you so much for being here, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, Lauren. I appreciate it. And hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm thrilled to be here today with LDA talking about dysgraphia, because part of the reason I got into this was feeling like there wasn't enough information out there when I was going through a number of struggles with my own family. So we are going to kick it off looking at this student, Noah. So do you know a student like Noah? You talk to him and he seems really bright, has good conversations with you, but he is completely avoidant of all his homework. He's complaining, he's grumpy. If he has to write something down or do a worksheet, he writes as little as possible. One-word answers, doing all the math in his head, won't write all the steps out, has messy writing, the spacing is all over the place, maybe large letters, small letters. And often a student like this might be acting out or not performing very well in school, even though you think, oh, they actually seem very bright, but things aren't matching up. This is the kid we want you to be looking out for. I know we probably have parents and educators on this call, but these are some of the kids we are trying to help by being here today and talking about dysgraphia. So this is the typical presentation that we see, and obviously all of these learning disabilities are individualized, that can look very different than this, but the most common kind of story we hear in our community is that things start to manifest around 7 or 8. That's when writing starts to get harder in school. So it starts to manifest around that time that you're seeing these problems. The child's starting to struggle, homework can be a battle, a lot of avoidance, unclear handwriting can be very difficult to read. The spacing is often an issue. So a lot of times spelling is just not sticking with these students. They are not really spelling well, or they're spelling very, in some cases, phonetically what they hear and not the ways they've been taught. You see lack of capitalization, punctuation. A lot of times this happens even when they're copying and you're like, oh, but the word was right there. Why can't you get that on paper? And then similar to Noah, I hear this all the time. My child has all these great thoughts when speaking, but can't seem to get them out on paper. So that's what we're really thinking about and talking about today. So the outline for my talk today is, what is dysgraphia? Who might have dysgraphia, and what can we do about it? Or how do we start helping students like Noah? It'll have more of a focus on elementary school, honestly, because that's where more is known. There are more potential interventions at the moment, but we're also going to touch on middle and high school. I did not include anything about transition to college. I know LDA has done some great webinars lately specifically to that transition. So today we'll just talk about sort of elementary, middle, high school age students. And then how do we provide understanding and support, which is part of the title of this talk. So let's start with, what is dysgraphia? And unfortunately, the answer is, well, that depends. It's actually a very complicated answer. So if you look up the new World Health Organization ICD-11, so that's the International Classification of Diseases, 11th edition. This is the one that came out early this year. In that system, dysgraphia is actually listed as a synonym for code 6A031, which is developmental learning disorder with impairment in written expression. And I have here on this slide how they're defining impairment in written expression, but it's basically a developmental learning disorder with difficulties learning academic skills related to writing. So in this new system, WHO is really defining dysgraphia as impairment in written expression fairly broadly. They're not the only ones doing this. This is a review that was written by a physician researcher who said, at its broadest definition, dysgraphia is a disorder of writing ability at any stage, including problems with letter formation and legibility, letter spacing, spelling, fine motor coordination, rate of writing, grammar, and composition. So this is the really broad definition of dysgraphia, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute, but this is the definition we've embraced as a support community because we really want to advocate and support students and adults who are struggling in any of these different areas and help find ways to help. Similarly, this is Dr. Pfeiffer, who gave an excellent webinar to our community, and he has a neuropsychological test called the Pfeiffer Assessment of Writing. And within that, he defines 3 subtypes of dysgraphia. Graphomotor, which is talking about the specific motor skills. Dyslexic dysgraphia is what he calls the spelling and the phonological or orthographic problems with writing. And then executive dysgraphia, working memory, organization, executive function. We did a community poll saying, simplifying these terms, but saying, what is it that your child, this was specific to parents, what is it that your child is struggling with when it comes to written expression? And this is what we found. There are hugely high levels of all 3 of these things throughout our community. So it's not that we're seeing that, kids are only having trouble with handwriting or only having trouble with spelling or organization. For most of the community, it is 2 or even 3 of these things. Many students have difficulties all across the spectrum, and it's not specific to one single area when it comes to written expression. So where this gets so complicated is that in the old World Health Organization ICD-10 system, which is the one that is currently implemented in this country and others for diagnosis, there are 2 different codes. So F8181 is a disorder of written expression. This is more like what we were just talking about, where spelling and organization of thoughts help impair you writing something down. But they use the term dysgraphia in a different code that's specific for motor coordination problems. And so right now there's a bit of a divide in the community in that some people are using dysgraphia as a broad, all-encompassing term for both of these types of things. And in other places, people are using it specific to the handwriting and motor coordination and fine motor issues of writing, and not including spelling and grammar under their definition of dysgraphia. For the APA, the American Psychological Association, their DSM-5, which a lot of people diagnose off of, there isn't a reference to dysgraphia. There you would be diagnosed with a specific learning disorder with impairment in written expression. There's a specific diagnostic code for that. That can be divided into problems with spelling, grammar, or organization of written expression. And then what becomes really important for parents and educators is when you look at IDEA. IDEA uses different language altogether, which many of you from the LDA community might be familiar with. But for students in our community, what they generally fall under in IDEA is the category of a specific learning disability. So specific learning disability means a disorder in one or more of the basic physiological processes involved in understanding or using language. And you can see where I've highlighted here, this includes written language, including how you think, write, and spell your language. So for the large majority of the people that I consider in the dysgraphia community, if they need a school-based diagnosis, that needs to be as specific learning disability in written expression to qualify for school-based special education services. So language matters. Here are all these different terms, many of whom I've just gone over, that people are talking about similar, related, sometimes the same things in different ways. And it's important to be aware of all these different definitions because it could impact your qualification for a school-based IEP or something like that. These are how many different people are talking about it. And there's even more than I already explained. Many parents will talk about students having learning differences instead of using the word disability because they feel there's nothing wrong with their child. We hear that commonly, and it's an understandable point of view. There's also a lot of pushback on even language we use sometimes from the neurodiversity community, which I also completely relate to, that all of the people in our community are neurodiverse, and that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them. That is how their mind works. Their mind works differently. So you should be described as a dysgraphic individual instead of as a person with dysgraphia or a person with a learning disability. Again, a very valid viewpoint, and the language matters and may change in the context that we're having these conversations. So I applaud LDA who put this on their Facebook page last month that I took note of about why are we using this term? This is why, we have a reason for it. And, it's really meaningful. And they point back to that school-based idea reference that you need to qualify under specific learning disability, which I think is a very important implication as we go forward today and talk about some of the different things that you can qualify for under school. So why do we use the word dysgraphia? I've gotten this question before. And obviously, there's a lot of confusion. I don't think there's one right answer at this point, but what we find is that people get it. And that really drives support and understanding in the community. If you take that broad definition of dysgraphia and say that it's all problems in written expression, no matter where on the spectrum you fit, it is somewhat analogous with dyslexia, where there's a lot of different types of dyslexia and ways that someone can potentially be dyslexic biologically. But I find myself explaining to people all the time that dysgraphia can be basically the reverse of dyslexia. If dyslexia is trouble reading the information, getting it into your brain from the paper, dysgraphia can be the opposite. You have the information, you have trouble getting it back out on the paper. And to the average person that we need to raise awareness for, that makes a lot of sense. And that's one of the major reasons, along with some of the broad definitions that are being supported by researchers in the community, that we're using the phrase dysgraphia. So takeaways from the first part: as a community, we absolutely need to harmonize these definitions so that we are all talking about the same thing at the same time. It should be clear when someone is talking about their learning disability, what that means, so that people can help. And I don't think that's where we are today. It is common to have problems with both the motor coordination and handwriting aspects of writing and spelling and grammar. Those are not generally separate in a lot of the people that we talk to. So written expression can be many different things. And I'll use the term today, dysgraphia, in its broadest sense to encompass all aspects of written expression, as I've talked about previously. Not everyone may agree with me, but that's how we're going to move forward today for the purpose of this talk. Okay, so now we've talked about what dysgraphia is, even if it's a little bit confusing, but who has it? So what does it look like? What does the community that we're talking about look like? It's a lot more common than you may think. We need better research and better prevalence studies, but here's a few that have quoted numbers. One study in 2016 said the prevalence for developmental writing disorders is about 7 to 15% among school-age children. That is a lot of children. The Chung article that I showed you earlier talks about between 10 and 30% of children experiencing difficulties writing, but that the prevalence would depend on your definition of dysgraphia, as we just talked about. There are studies that show that it can be more common in boys, and dysgraphia can be, but is not always, accompanied by other learning disabilities. Most commonly in polls that we've done, we see that ADD, ADHD comes out on top, but followed not too far behind by dyslexia in combination with dysgraphia. So I showed this slide already, but again, this is kind of a typical presentation for many people to start to have these school-based struggles around the age of 7 and 8 that people, once that writing picks up. So assessment, another difficult topic. There's not one standard test or even set of tests that are used to diagnose right now. Testing for dysgraphia or specific learning disability of written expression is typically done as part of a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation by a psychologist. This can be done either in a school-based setting by a school-based psychiatrist or psychologist, or outside of school in private testing. I'll skip ahead for a minute, but in that I've been talking about some of the poll results we've done, we see that about 2/3 of the respondents have actually gone out and gotten private testing. This is a problem. It's not uncommon because many schools and school districts are not very familiar with learning disabilities and written expression, and don't really understand that when students need to be assessed or the level of assessment. And like I said, there's not standardized testing for it. So we find that many people go out, get private testing, and bring it back to the school district to try to prove their case about testing. This is a huge point of importance because it's not an option for everyone. This outside testing is expensive, and it's really going to continue to create huge educational disparities throughout our system. So it's something I want everyone to really think about and pay attention to, so that we can start to drive advocacy around this and make sure that it is not that you require private testing to be able to get the proper accommodations and interventions in a school-based setting. Importantly, there's also occupational therapy assessments. These are great and highly recommended for motor skills and sensory issues. We see a lot of students starting very early because of the handwriting struggles with OT, and that's another great assessment to have to understand if there are motor skills and sensory issues that are driving some of the dysgraphia. So takeaways number 2, dysgraphia is really common, much more than you would think, but we need more research on its exact prevalence. We start to see first and second graders as writing tasks get more difficult, begin to struggle. A full comprehensive psychological testing on an individual is the best way to diagnose, because not only will you get potentially that diagnosis you need for support, but also it will help identify which are the particular issues that your student may be having, so that then you can help direct what help that student might need. And we're finding that many school districts are not trained in recognizing this disability, which is creating educational disparities, and something as a larger LDA community we really need to all think about moving forward. So this is the biggest question I think people generally have is, what can we do about it? We're recognizing these problems, so now what can we do? So my biggest take-home point today is that intervention and accommodation should be very individualized to your student. We talked about a lot of different types of challenges, and I'll go through these more in depth, but it's going to depend on the challenges that your student is having, what the right ways to potentially work with them and address them are. It's also going to depend on age, grade level, the complexity of the work that they need to do. And just like other learning disabilities, this isn't something that people outgrow. There's some remediation that can help with improving handwriting, improving spelling and grammar skills, but there's also a lot of management and accommodation, particularly for people who are diagnosed older or as adults, or we find that most adults in our community didn't know this exists, never knew they had it, and have just learned how to manage over the years through a lot of different tools and accommodations. So it's not something that just goes away. Parts of it can be improved, but it's something that needs to be thought about through one's entire life. School-based help. I am not going to go into detail in all of this. LDA has a lot of great information about this, and many of you are probably familiar with this, but there are two different pathways within schools to really get help. One is 504 plans, which prevents discrimination of those with disabilities. These are, in a practical sense, these are used to include accommodations that will help support a student on a level playing field with other students in the class. The other path is through individualized education programs, or IEP. These are legal documents under the IDEA Act, and the IEP has a spot for these accommodations, but importantly also has measurable annual goals that the school system needs to work on with a student. So as we go through this next part, I'm going to talk about both potential accommodations that can be used and give a few examples of what an IEP goal could look like in this area. I completely recognize that 504s and IEPs may be specific to public school districts. There are many kids who are in private schools. There are many kids who are homeschooled. The examples that I'm providing, although I'm putting them in more of a public school context, really should be able to be implemented in any setting. You can use these accommodations even if you're homeschooling. This might be a goal you want to work on with your own child. So while I have it today in sort of a public school filter, please consider this as a much more broad recommendations of things that might be able to help people with learning disability written expression. So as I said, most is really known about elementary school at this point. Dysgraphia is just getting a little bit more awareness. We'll talk about that at the end, but many high schoolers, college students, adults had no idea, particularly adults, that this was even a type of learning disability when they went through school. So we're finding that this earlier generation who's now in elementary, there is more help and more support, and it's easier to access some of these things at this level, for better or for worse. Keys in elementary school. You want to focus on handwriting interventions early. When kids are still working on their handwriting, it's still normal to be working on handwriting within your classroom. They also learn handwriting quite well at these younger ages compared to later in life. It can still be taught later in life, but we definitely hear that it's much easier and much more successful with a lot of students to work on handwriting interventions early. Spelling and grammar rules are really important. I'm going to comment in a minute on structured literacy. And also at this age, you can start a little bit with introduction and teaching of technology. There's a lot of debate about when you switch over to technology. I think building some of those skills early is important because it becomes really useful accommodation later on. There's no exact set timing for when to do it. It depends somewhat on the student and the circumstances, but understanding that technology can be a tool can start as early as elementary school. So let's go more in depth into these three things. So if you think about handwriting and fine motor, I already said this can be a great focus area when students are young. How much can you improve the handwriting, work on different handwriting curricula? I highly recommend occupational therapy evaluations. This can be done in two ways. It can be done within a school system or outside of school. There are benefits to both. In the school-based occupational therapy, you can also include things like occupational therapy, IEP goals, and things like that in a formal school-based plan. Unfortunately, school-based occupational therapy really has to focus on schools. And as you might imagine, students with dysgraphia often have other issues related to fine motor abilities and things like that that make life skills harder too. Tying your shoes is one we hear all the time. And outside of school OT can work on shoe tying with your child. However, a school-based OT has to work on school-based academic skills, and in most situations cannot. So there are pluses and minuses to where and how you see OT for a child, but for the motor coordination, handwriting, OT can be a huge help for a lot of children. One thing that I talk about a lot is ensuring that handwriting is purposeful. And this will be sort of a theme as we go on. I have a story later. Teaching handwriting, if you are sort of tracing letters or going through handwriting in a really meaningful way to learn how to make the letters, is absolutely useful. Children should be learning handwriting, even if they're struggling with it, to try to develop those skills. What is not always useful is just copying things off the board with no explicit instruction or understanding of why you are doing that. So writing should be a tool that has a purpose for kids with dysgraphia. It shouldn't be, it should be minimized in situations that are really not going to bring a lot of help. Similarly, with handwriting, don't forget about spacing, capitalization, punctuation. These all go in with it and are all skills that can be taught at this age. Cursive is something to consider. I know it is not taught in a lot of schools now. If you think about cursive, one of the great things about cursive from the perspective of a dysgraphic individual is, one, you don't have to lift your pencil throughout the word and remember where to start and remember how to draw the letters. It's just a continuous flow. And two, all the letters start at the bottom. So it really just makes more sense for many people who are learning to write cursive. It's something, it's the reason our logo is in cursive. It doesn't work for everybody, but it can definitely be helpful for certain students to really approach their writing in cursive instead of in more typical print. You can also do things for handwriting and fine motor around hand strengthening fidgets. There's a lot of games out there that can increase motor skills with, very young with tweezers, even things like Jenga, classic games. There's a lot of motor skill related games. So there's ways to work on handwriting and fine motor that are not necessarily even just writing, that might be more fun and engaging for a student. When you start to look at accommodations, there are a number of accommodations that may help. I will say spacing paper is the #1 thing that people take from our site. I think that we have a store recommendations, and that is every single year, the #1 thing that is bought. There's some great spacing paper that shows exactly how far apart each letter should be. Some of it looks just like notebook paper and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. It has that spacing. It shows you where to start and stop your lines. It can really help students figure out how to get their thoughts in a readable way onto pages. Writing on slant boards is good for some students. Many people prefer certain pens or pencils, also pencil grips. I don't have those on here, but they can be a useful tool. Fidgeting tools to kind of get out extra fine motor things. Another accommodation we see in a school-based context is extra time for writing assignments. Ways to minimize writing. I mentioned this. Writing should be purposeful. No or reduced copying. This is one of the top accommodations that people have in 504 and IEP plans, is how can I get someone to either scribe, a teacher gives me notes for my class, homework assignments that are written on the board in today's day and age. Can you take a picture of the board with an iPad or computer you might have? How do we reduce copying just for the sake of copying? Early utilization of keyboarding, we'll talk about that more in a moment. And things like marking responses on the test booklet for fill in the bubble formats. Why make these students fill in the little bubble when they can just tell you the answer by circling like A or B versus these types of Scantron forms? So these are all things that can be incorporated. And then here's an example of an IEP goal in handwriting. And there's kind of 5 examples here. You could put any or multiple of these things. But it's to say IEP goals in general, and the ones that I'll show you here, really should have very specific goals with a measurement tool, a goal date, and then, if appropriate, use of an accommodation to achieve the goal. So they're like SMART goals for anyone who has to write those in a business concept. But they're specific and measurable and timely. So what we're really looking at here is, can you work with the student to write some of these elements, printing their name, manuscript, cursive, numbers, with correct size and spacing and orientation to the line, potentially using an accommodation like spacing paper, as measured by, do you have a rubric, how you grade, what does that look like, how will we measure that? And by what time will they be able to achieve this accuracy? And so that's how you want to think about these goals. What are very specific things that a student could work on in a special education context, or, as I said, homeschooling or something like that, to really make sure that they are working on the right things. And I'll give IEP goals in other areas as we move forward. So assistive technology. This is always a question. I don't think there's a exact answer, but we say kind of mid to late elementary, you should be asking for assistive technology evaluations. The preferred types of assistive technology may change over time for your students, but I personally believe it's good to have options in there, even if they're not utilizing them all. There are many types of assistive technology that you can put into a school-based plan. Early keyboarding is one that we highly encourage. Many students can get their thoughts out much better by typing than they can by writing. It is possible to write IEP goals on touch typing. Can you write a goal that says by a certain date, someone will be typing at a certain accuracy and or words per minute? Those are things that can be included. So teaching keyboarding early so that they have that tool is important. Word prediction software on some of those computers can be useful. It's just like on your phone, when you start typing a word and words pop up that are the option, they can choose the right word. It helps with accommodating spelling as well as accommodating handwriting in some ways because you're using the technology. Some students love voice to text to be able to get their ideas out. I will say Google Docs, other software have free voice to text programs that are actually really pretty good and easy to use. You do need to work on your editing skills typically if you're doing voice to text, but a lot of times it's great for, okay, we're doing brainstorming first as pre-writing. What are all the ideas you can think of? If in that context you can use voice to text to get all your ideas out, it can really help the rest of your writing. So voice to text is something, not all students love it because it can single them out if you're using it in the classroom. Some will use it at home more than they'll use it at school, but it can definitely be a valuable tool used in the right situation. Similarly, there's lots of apps and software that are being developed and coming. There's things for scanning in worksheets and being able to type your answers onto worksheets. There's a couple products for how to do math online and not have to write everything out. These assistive technology options are things you should really consider as your student, particularly as we'll talk about, gets into older grades. So we talked about handwriting and fine motor. So let's move on to that language and spelling and grammar piece of things. So again, it's nice today. I'm talking to a Learning Disabilities Association of America audience. I'm guessing a lot of people in the audience maybe have heard of Orton Gillingham approaches and structured literacy. This is talked about extensively in the context of dyslexia. It's used for acquiring written language and spelling skills, really there are major keys here, which are all repeated on the slide. But what it goes back to is explicit literacy instruction that should be systematic, sequential, cumulative, going on. And also an important component is multisensory. And so this has been based in language principles. It's scientifically peer reviewed. There are a lot of good curriculums out there that take an Orton-Gillingham approach that are considered structured literacy. We do not recommend any specific one, but we do recommend that kids who have a lot of issues with the spelling and the literacy and the, phonological and orthographic problems with writing words are taught using these types of approaches and with a method that falls under structured literacy. So unfortunately, this approach is not the norm. When we ask parents, has your child been taught using one of these approaches? We only had a little more than a third of the parents say yes. So we had a really small sample size in this poll of adults, but barely more than 10% said yes. So definitely wasn't the norm for the adults. Even with the students are not necessarily getting this type of instruction. What I'm hoping is going to happen is that there is a lot of conversation now about the science of reading. Won't go into all the debates and discussion. I'm sure you can find a lot of literature there, but there's a lot of people right now talking about the science of reading and how we need to bring this type of structured literacy into classrooms for everyone. And I and others truly believe that this is a needed systemic change in literacy instruction. And the good news for all of us in the community of people with specific learning disability and written expression, this is going to make a difference for our students too. Not just the students who are diagnosed with dyslexia and reading difficulties. This level of explicit multisensory literacy is going to help also in the dysgraphia community. So we should all be advocates for really pushing the science of reading, for more research on the science of writing, but these go hand in hand. And hopefully changes that are being made will really be helpful to our community as the years go on. I will say in my own local school district, none of this was taught. You could only get explicit structured literacy type programs in special education until this year, and they just made the change, and now the entire elementary school has a section for word study, or depending on your grade level, where they are starting to teach in this way. And I do think that this is going to help going forward. If your school is not doing it yet, if your child, your student is not doing it yet, push for it in a special education context, but we should all be pushing for it in general classrooms as well, in my opinion. So there are also spelling grammar accommodations. I mentioned part of that explicit instruction is multisensory tools. I have the blocks here for a reason. A big piece of learning literacy in a multisensory way can be very helpful. So you don't have to spell with handwriting. You can spell with blocks. You can spell with word roots. You can spell lots of ways that are manipulatives, that are ways for students to learn things that is not just writing it down. So utilize that in spelling and grammar type lessons. Again, that early utilization of technology, at some point students will move over to thinking about spell check and word prediction, and how do they make sure that things that they have spelled correctly or that they have spelled incorrectly get fixed. We see many people with spelling not graded on certain assignments and tests as a particular accommodation. Also checklists about going back and editing for spelling, capitalization, punctuations, that can make differences in kids' writing as well. So some IEP goals in this area. This one is using this type of structured literacy approach. A student will correctly spell words based on specific rules that are being taught in unedited, spontaneously written classroom papers. I like this one because I find that students can sometimes act upon that rule correctly when you're teaching the rule, but then when they're spontaneously writing, do they maintain it? And that's what's important, is not only being able to do it, at the time that you're doing that activity, but how do we make sure students are really committing those rules to memory, or really understanding how to use them in general writing and in classroom papers. So this is one I kind of like. Also, as I said, capitalization, punctuation are important here too. So can a student write a 3 or 4 word sentence, also using correct capitalization or punctuation in a certain number of opportunities by a day? The third area is composition and organization of thoughts. Just like students need explicit instruction in spelling, grammar, literacy, they also need explicit instruction in the process of writing. And this gets lost sometimes. It can be all sorts of things. It could be, how do you go from a simple sentence to a complex sentence? It can be organization of a paragraph or a full essay with introductions, conclusions. How do you write a transition? And then the whole process of sort of organizing your thoughts, pre-writing, drafting, and then reviewing and editing before finalizing a piece. These are all things that many people take for granted, but need to be explicitly taught to students in our community, so they can really think through the process of writing and how they do each step and follow an appropriate process to produce the best product that they can at the end. So things like writing prompts, graphic organizers. This is a classic one here with the hamburger, where you have a topic sentence and a closing sentence and details in between. You can also make a similar one that for kind of 5-paragraph essays and how you set those up. Sometimes filling a structure to fill in an outline to help you organize your thoughts about what you're supposed to be writing about. And then editing checklists are all accommodations that can be put into plans, used in classrooms, used in home teaching, to really help students be able to conceptualize a full piece of writing. So some IEP goals and composition. When given a topic, the student will write a cohesive paragraph 4 out of 5 times with 90% accuracy based on a rubric. All of these obviously are variable, but we're just giving some examples. When given a variety of sentences, the student will expand them by adding describing words. How many times with certain accuracy? How do you take a simple sentence, turn it into a more complex sentence to really help your writing moving forward? There are ways to work with particularly older students, older elementary, and as we get we'll talk about middle and high school in a minute, but how do you really expand your thoughts and make sure you're detailing out your written expression? So one thing I really want to point out today is that small changes can make a big difference. This is a story I've told before, but I think it's really, really important. We knew a 4th grade student who was supposed to do a digital citizenship assignment. It was all about how to be a good online citizen, no bullying, being respectful, things like that. It was 10 separate chapters. And at the end of each chapter of work, you had to fill out a page with 5 questions, a paragraph for each, at least a couple sentences for each of these 5 questions. And the teacher gave it as the first kind of long-term project for 4th grade, that you had to really plan out your time and work on it as a extended project, where we're not just doing it today, it's due tomorrow. I think it was 6 weeks or something like that to go through all 10 chapters, and wanted to try to teach time management throughout this project. Parent noticed that her dysgraphic student was not doing the assignment, because she kept saying, don't you have this big assignment? Have you started? Hadn't started, wouldn't start, protested every time she mentioned it. They were fighting about it. So the parent ended up calling the teacher and saying, is this a writing assignment? And the teacher said, no, this is really to make sure that they understand the content of this digital citizenship curriculum. So they had a conversation, and in the end, what they agreed upon was that the student would go through the chapters, and instead of writing the answers to these 5 different questions, he would just pick up his iPad and record himself answering the 5 questions and send it to her. Parent went home, told the student was so excited, got right to work, like went through the first chapter like that night and started doing it and turned the assignment in early, did great with time management, did great on the assignment. It turned the entire assignment around for this student. The whole protest was not wanting to write what totaled 50 different written responses, which was just so overwhelming to this child that they couldn't even start on it because it just writing 50 responses felt so hard. The simple act of being able to turn it in recorded made all the difference. And the student did well in it, and the teacher got what the teacher wanted as well, because the student learned the content, which was really the whole point. So this is my favorite example of a small change making a huge difference. It really made the student successful. They got the information that they needed. The teacher was happy. The parent didn't fight with the student anymore, so the parent was happy. Made a huge difference. And so I really want to challenge everyone in the audience today to think about this in the case of whether it be your child or student, someone you know. What are some of these small changes that could actually make a really impactful difference in someone's learning? So with that, we'll go on to middle and high school. This section, unfortunately, is a lot shorter. I think these are things that are still challenging and still being worked out by a lot of people in a lot of school districts. But what we see in middle and high school is a high level of utilization of accommodations, particularly technology and extended time. There may still be that structured literacy that I talked about. The students may be able to qualify for special education in the structured literacy, but that is not everywhere and is not standard. You can also look for certified tutors, things like that outside of school if needed. There's a lot of good organizations that train in certified tutors. Honestly, even with dysgraphic kids, if you look for resources for dyslexic kids for structured literacy, there are a fair amount of them out there. And students here really need that explicit writing instruction. So middle and high school has a lot of challenges. Writing may be a part of every class that you go to now. It's not just that you're writing during language arts. You have all these different classes and you may be writing for every single one. We also see that different teachers have a different willingness to utilize or implement accommodations, even when they're in plans. So it's something you really need to think about is, how do we accommodate in these different classes and make sure that the accommodations are being used to set the students up for success? And the other challenge is that at this age, compositions get much more complicated. You have different types of writing that you're doing, depending on the class, also depending on the goal of the piece. Much longer composition, you might need more planning and organization to write longer essays. And some need things like note-taking, which again might be hard for a student with a specific learning disability and written expression. Like a research paper, the note-taking itself might be difficult to then produce the research paper. So there are a lot of challenges at this age. Number one thing to do, talk with your student. This is an age that you need to have students develop a level of self-advocacy, because at this age, many of the middle school, junior high, and into high school teachers don't necessarily want to talk to the parents as much. They want the student to come talk to them. The student needs to learn those self-advocacy skills to say, hey, I really need to use this accommodation to successfully do this assignment, and how can I work with you on that? It's also important to talk with your student on what kinds of goals and accommodations they want. I mentioned not all students like voice to text because they don't want to be singled out in class. It's important when you're setting up plans with a school district or school system to understand the implications of the things that you put in. For example, if sometime I've seen the example where if you put a break every hour on a certain test, that means they put your student in a different room to take that test. And the student may not want to be singled out like that. If you put a flexible break in, it's possible that the student may just be able to raise their hand and say they want to go to the bathroom. Doesn't look different than any other student, but they still get a break that they might need from doing the writing during that essay or test. So a lot of times it's important to talk with your student about what they're comfortable with, what considerations are important to them in a school-based setting, and what accommodations they want to set them up for success. Also, you can now at this stage start to include students in these meetings when appropriate. But the one word of advice I would give is to make sure there's a discussion of the student's strengths. If you are doing that and having the students in the meetings, it can be demoralizing for students to go into a meeting, and even for parents, it can be more demoralizing to go into IEP meetings and hear, these are all the things this student is struggling with. So you definitely want to lead with what is the student well, if you're doing well, if you're going to include them in that meeting. Many of these accommodations we've already talked about, but they're very useful in middle and high school. Computing, time for test taking, audio recordings or notes in some other way, oral presentation of work. I mentioned the video responses. Assistive technology, we see a lot of kids using not only spell check, but at this point, grammar check. Grammarly tells you if you're allowed to use it. Grammarly tells you what your grammatical mistakes were and why they were wrong. So it can be a positive for learning as well as fixing your errors. And again, a lot of different apps are starting to come on the market for how do you make this writing process easier. IEP goals will get a little bit more complicated at this point. You can do things like, after selecting a topic, can the student make a simple outline of what they need to write about across all classes? And I think the across all classes here is important, because maybe you can outline in English because you were taught how to do that, but can you make a similar outline if you have to write something for a science class or a history class? What does that look like? And then we talked about how writing is a process before, about organization, pre-drafting, drafting, reviewing and editing before publication. Will the student use the steps in the writing process across all classes? So that was a lot on accommodations and goals, but the takeaways here are that there are a lot of accommodations that can help. And there are a lot of goals that can be written in many of these areas. A lot of times we hear from people that the school or somebody doesn't know what the right types of goals are for the student. There are many different options here, and these can be included, but they should be tailored to your student's needs every year and reassessed as to where the student is, what's the student's needs, and what is the student comfortable with. Many of these can be easier to implement in younger grades, but we find awareness is growing. You can be part of that, advocating for your student, even in middle and high school, and helping them advocate for themselves. So I want to end with a short note on providing understanding and support, and then we will have at least a few minutes for questions. So what can you do? Little changes go a long way. We talked about that, but it's really important. Small changes can make a big difference. You really want to amplify your students' strengths. I know throughout school, my own child who struggled with this really owned his strengths in interesting ways. He became kind of the mastermind behind group projects, who would, do some of the work and tell all the kids what to do, but he would make all the other kids write everything down. And so he knew what he was good at, and he knew what he wasn't good at. And he was able to really amplify that to have great success in team and group project-based settings. Similarly, he was the tech support for some of his classes. Because of his early utilization of technology, he was really good with tech. So he became known as, one of the teacher's helpers in tech support, which really led him to positive experiences and amplifying his own strengths. We talked about advocate for your student. We really want everyone who's on this call to raise awareness that dysgraphia is real, dysgraphia is common, and we really need to be thinking about how to help people with struggles in written expression. And please know that there's a community for you. We are building a louder, active community, and it's growing. One thing we can do is share success stories. This comes from our blog. This one on the top left, When Writing is in Fantasy, is just from a few weeks ago, and is a really moving story I'd encourage you to read, about a student who had a pretty serious dysgraphia that was recognized by a teacher later on in her life, and that really made a difference in what she do. And she's just recently published her first fantasy novel. So there are great success stories out there, and I really encourage you to share, raise awareness, and know that these students are very bright. They can be successful. One shout out to our website. We provide education and information. We do have a free Dysgraphia webinar series. We are building slowly a professionals database where you can find professionals to try to help. So either consider joining that or searching in it. Helpful resources for you, those success stories I just talked about. Coming in January 2023, we've been writing an ebook on how to develop IEP goals for written expression. So that will be out at the start of the year. I gave you a few examples today, but many more examples will be included in that resource once it's available. And please come say hello to us at LDA's conference in February. We're going to be talking a touch of the information today, but also expanding a lot more on the importance of dysgraphia research in a talk at that conference. And I want to say it takes a village. Thanks to LDA for having me here to talk about this today, but we are partnering with many, many people. We would love to get to know you, partner with you. It's going to take all of us to raise awareness about dysgraphia. On here, I have our webinar for next week with COPA, the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates. We partnered with Turn Right Around to help raise awareness of their Dysgraphia Awareness Day, and was thrilled to be kind of the kickoff speaker on October 3rd to talk about dysgraphia awareness. And all of these fabulous researchers and clinicians across the bottom have provided their time for free to contribute to our free webinar series. There are a lot of people who want to help. It's going to take all of us, and we encourage you to get involved. And so with that, thank you. Please reach out. Here's our general email, and I also put my personal email too. And besides the website, we're on social media. In most cases, it's at Dysgraphia. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, so much. That was such a helpful presentation. We're going to get to some questions now. We are a little bit close to time, but we're going to try to get in as many as we can. So our first question, do kids with dysgraphia have difficulty with visual and spatial skills? And is there any overlap with the symptoms of a nonverbal learning disorder?
So yes, on visual and spatial skills, not always, but in some cases there definitely are. We see that sometimes with the spacing and the handwriting and the paper, that they don't have excellent visual spatial processing to understand where the where the letters should be placed in that way. I'm not as positive, and therefore I'm going to kind of defer on the overlap with the other disorders. We do see some overlap with pretty much all learning disabilities, but I don't know the specific percentages there to talk to that one.
So if children are having issues with handwriting, will they also have issues with finding letters on the keyboard? Will they still have the same struggles keyboarding as they do with handwriting?
Sometimes. There are some people who teach adaptive keyboarding instead of just normal touch type keyboarding for students who have struggles finding those keys in the same way. Again, this is why I really encourage those comprehensive evaluations, because different things affect different students in different ways. But there are absolutely people teaching adapted keyboarding with less fingers and more mobility. There are other students who, with a little bit of practice, take to normal touch typing initially. I would probably start with regular touch typing. There are a number of good typing programs out there. And then from there, if it's not sticking, not working, look into that adaptive keyboarding.
All right. We have a question about IEPs. Is it okay to have a handwriting goal, spelling, and organizing thoughts goal all at the same time? I want to ask for these, but how many goals is too many?
Yes, it is okay. I think many people have 4 or 5 goals in their plan. I think it's perfectly appropriate to put one in all of those areas. It may be that in something like the sort of spelling type goal, you have to focus on a single spelling concept first, and then once that's achieved, go back and edit the IEP to go to the next concept. So you may have to edit more often because a goal was achieved. However, that's allowed. You can request edits to your IEP at any time. So completely appropriate to have those. And as I said, you can also add things like technology, OT goals. There's a lot of organization for our kids with ADHD too. Many of them will have one goal based around organization as well.
All right, great. Well, and we are at time, but I just wanted to ask one more question because we had a couple of questions about cursive. At what age should cursive be introduced? And also, do you have any suggestions for writing within the lines?
At what age, I think, is a bit of a debate. Most school systems will introduce it around 3rd grade after print. There are people who believe you should teach cursive first. I don't think there's a definite answer there. I think where you should do it is with your child's willingness to do it. If the child's very resistant, then maybe wait a little bit longer. But if the child's really interested in learning it very soon after, maybe you've done print, because now pretty much everywhere teaches print first, despite some people saying that literature is better for cursive first, as early as possible. And then for all of us adults, most people's writing in the end tends to look like whatever you prefer. So there's people who write all in cursive, there's people who write mix. Eventually, students figure out what works for them. Writing in the lines is, a challenge that I think just needs to be reinforced. The spacing paper can help. It takes a lot of practice. Bigger lines are often helpful to start for a long time, but at some point students won't want to do that because they won't want to use different paper from their peers, which is why I like that spacing paper that looks a lot like notebook paper. But that really just takes a lot of handwriting practice, and again, work with an OT can really help there too.
All right, well, thank you so much for your answers. Please check out Dysgraphia Life and also our conference in February from the 21st to the 23rd. Dr. King will be there expanding on this topic. And this webinar has been recorded, so please expect within 48 hours a copy of this recording and a copy of the handouts. Dr. King, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.